Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to go over some of the most common forms of poetry, okay? So as I've mentioned, form is basically the shape of a poem, how a poem is just shaped or laid out. Now, when it comes to form, there's lots of really common forms that poems and poets employ. So what I wanted to do was to kind of go through a list of the different types of form that you should be familiar with and you should know what they mean. Therefore, if you read a type of poem following one of these forms that I mentioned, then you can instantly pick it out, okay? So when it comes to this list, this is a fairly long list, okay? So I will be kind of updating this list as I go through this lesson. Now let's begin with the first type of form, which is fairly common. It is what we call a sonnet. Now remember that a sonnet is a 14-line poem. It must be a 14-line poem, no less or no more, okay? So it's a 14-line poem which is written in iambic pentameter and it's traditionally about love, okay? If you're not clear what iambic pentameter is, I have lots of lessons going over that. However, the easiest way to remember iambic pentameter is when you're reading a line of poetry, each line is it 10 syllables and is the first syllable unstressed, the second syllable stressed, and that happens 5 times, okay? Again, if you're not clear, just check out my lesson on iambic pentameter, okay? It's actually fairly easy to understand once you wrap your mind around it. So just to quickly recap, sonnet is 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter and it's traditionally about love, but sometimes it's used ironically, such as, for example, how Ozymandias talks about a king that's passed away, and it's written in a sonnet form, but actually we realize he uses that ironically because he doesn't actually like the king. Now, the next form to be aware of is a ballad. Now, what a ballad is a traditional type of poem which tells a very dramatic story, okay? So a ballad must always have a dramatic story included within the poem. Now, it was originally, so it's a very old style of poem, okay? And it was originally written as a musical tale, okay? It's a very old style of poem. And we usually find ballads are written in quatrains, in other words, 4-line stanzas, which are, in terms of the rhyme scheme, A-B rhyme scheme or A-B-C-B, okay? So that's a ballad. Now, the next popular type of form is what we call an ode. Now, an ode is actually a very old style of poetry that originated in ancient Greece, okay? So in classic civilization. So an ode came from ancient Greece and it basically is a poem that praises a person, event or object, and it's usually fairly brief, okay? So an ode tends to be a poem that's praising a person, but it's actually quite brief. Now, the next poem to be aware of is an elegy. What this poem is it's about somebody who has passed away. It is celebrating the memory of a deceased person, someone that's died. That's what we call an elegy. So let's move on to the next type of form, which is free verse. Now, bear in mind that free verse is simply a poem that does not follow any set structure, okay? It's actually very free-flowing. In other words, it can have however many numbers of stanzas. It can have, one stanza that's fairly long or fairly short. It's not constrained by any type of pattern, any type of structure, okay? That's why it's called free flowing or free verse. Now remember, this is actually a very modern style of poetry, okay? This form is a very modern construction. Traditional poems and poems from long ago used to follow a very rigid form, okay? So free verse tends to be a bit more of a modern style of poetry. The next poem to be aware of is the acrostic poem, and you've probably heard of it, especially in primary school, okay? Now, this is a poem where the first letter of each line spells out a name, word, or phrase. For example, let's say you've written happy, H-A-P-P-Y, right? You write it on one side, and then for each letter, you then write out a verse of poetry, okay? So again, very, very popular with school teachers. The next form to be aware of, which is again very, very well known, is what we call the limerick, okay? Now, a limerick is a very humorous type of poem and it has an A-A-B-B-A structure, okay? So limerick is a poem that's supposed to be quite funny, all right? Now, in terms of this style of poem, that it does follow a specific way of laying out, okay? It has a layout. Now, remember, within a limerick, lines 1, 2, and 5 within a stanza must be longer than lines 3 and 4, okay? So lines 1, 2, and 5 are much, much longer than lines 3 and 4. And the end of the poem tends to be the funniest aspect of the poem. This is where we have the punchline, okay? Now, moving on to a poem which is from Japan called the haiku. Now, this is a very ancient Japanese form of poetry, okay? So it's written, this ancient form of poetry is written in tercets, which is 3-line stanzas, okay? So remember that a haiku is a traditional Japanese poem that's written in tercets, and lines 1 and 3 have 5 syllables, okay? So within each tercet, within each 3-line poem, the first and the third line of poetry has, you'd be able to count out 5 syllables. However, the second line, the middle line, must have 7 syllables. Moreover, the other form to be aware of, and this obviously takes us to the end of the list, okay, so this is the list of fairly common forms that you should be aware of, is the villanelle style of poetry, okay? So the villanelle style of poetry actually originates from France, all right? So this is an old type of poem from France, and it has 19 lines in total, and these lines are split up into different types of stanzas. Now, you have 5 stanzas within a villanelle, which are made up of 3 lines, and they follow the ABA structure, okay? So of these 19 lines, this is how it's broken up. It has 5 stanzas of 3 lines, which are an ABA rhyme scheme. Then you have 1 stanza made up of 4 lines, what we would call obviously a quatrain. 3 lines is tercet, 4 line is quatrain, and it follows an ABAA rhyme scheme, okay? So that's really it when it comes to understanding the most popular forms of poetry, okay? So of course, again, this list is not exhaustive. You can obviously add more different styles of forms, but these are the most popular you will find that you're studying, okay? 1 or more of these are going to find yourself studying, so it's good to know what you should anticipate and what you should expect when you're looking at the form of any type of poem. Thank you so much for listening.